Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Commander-in-Chief, Partisanship, Nationalism, and the Reconstruction of Congressional War, by Casey B.K. Dominguez. Narrated by Nancy Peterson. Publisher's Note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface. As it is for most academics, the bulk of the work I do, and the most important work I do, is teaching undergraduates. The idea for this book came from conversations I had with students in my presidency class. Students in that class are always surprised to learn how much the political and constitutional center of gravity has shifted toward the presidency over time. They are amazed to learn that presidents did not always give speeches or campaign for themselves or claim the right to start wars. Those revelations prompt them to ask important normative questions about how the presidency should look, as well as empirical questions about how and why it has changed so much over time. This project was inspired by questions that my students asked about how and why the president's war powers grew over time. I have always assigned my presidency students to read Louis Fisher's Presidential War Power, which documents both Congress's insistence on initiating wars in the early republic and its acquiescence to presidentially led wars in the modern era. My students asked great questions about why those enormous changes took place, and all of us were unsatisfied with the answers that I could give based on the existing scholarly literature. My own curiosity led me to want to know more about how Congress managed to exert authority over war powers in the early republic, and to ask how that congressional control eroded over time. Motivated by this question, I began a complicated, decade-long project of gathering and analyzing all of the congressional references to the Commander-in-Chief Clause in published debates, from the founding to World War I. I thought that perhaps I could code the speeches for whether they favored congressional or presidential dominance of war powers, and then run regressions on those data that would help me test some basic hypotheses about how legislators understood the constitutional balance of war powers. As it turned out, the story that emerged as I read congressional speeches about the Commander-in-Chief Clause was quite nuanced, and the context of each speech was too important to lose that detail in simplistic coding schemes. I had originally intended to write a journal article, but what emerged was a book, and a long one at that. It took me deeper into U.S. history, into work on American political development, into questions about the impact of rhetoric and ideas on politics, and into the processes of constitutional interpretation than I originally anticipated. As I read congressional speeches, it quickly became clear that members of Congress talked differently about the Commander-in-Chief Clause in different contexts, that there were entirely different conversations about the president's capacity and Congress's to govern conquered territory, to discipline wayward officers, and to initiate hostile force. But there were also commonalities across those conversations and across party lines in the ways that members of Congress talked about war powers. I also realized that there were some big changes in congressional rhetoric over time, especially after the Spanish-American War and in the lead-up to World War I. In the chapters that follow, I describe the patterns that I observed when reading members of Congress's arguments about the Commander-in-Chief Clause. Members of Congress in the early republic narrowly defined the war powers of the president as Commander-in-Chief, but they also tended to support broader war powers for presidents in their own party. They defined the Commander-in-Chief Clause while repeating just a few simple stories that seemed to define the responsibilities of both Congress and the president. Then, enveloped by the nationalist rhetoric of the Spanish-American War around the turn of the 20th century, those stories began to change, and members of Congress began to argue that the Commander-in-Chief deserved their deference on questions related to war. The story that I tell in this book speaks perhaps more to scholars who want to understand how Congress interprets the Constitution than it does to undergraduates who want to understand why presidential war powers grew over time. But hopefully, Both scholars and students with an interest in the development of war powers in the U.S. constitutional system will learn something from this work that inspires them to ask different and perhaps better questions in the future. Introduction. Under the Constitution of 1787, the United States has fought 4 declared wars, dozens of other wars and military interventions, and 1 major civil war. The country has gone from a post-colonial backwater having no military to speak of to a global superpower with one of the most powerful militaries in the history of the world. Alongside all those conflicts and all that change, the constitutional system for managing war powers has evolved as well. The U.S. Constitution divides the federal government's authority over war and peace between Congress and the President, but it does not appear to do so equally. It vests executive power in the President and names him the Commander-in-Chief. But it also grants to Congress a long list of specific powers over international affairs, including regulating foreign commerce, declaring war, defining international law, making rules about prisoners of war, raising armies and navies, appropriating money, making rules for governing the armed forces, and determining the terms of militia's service in repelling invasions, executing law, and suppressing insurrections. This textual distribution of powers has remained the same for more than 2 centuries. But our interpretations of the authority those words grant to Congress and to the President have changed dramatically over time. In the early Republic, the branches of government agreed that Congress had exclusive authority to initiate hostilities against foreign powers in both declared and undeclared wars, and that presidents had a limited defense power to repel sudden attacks. At the time of the founding, understanding of defensive war was limited to when the nation was actually attacked, and Congress maintained authority over wars undertaken to defend national interests. In those days, both presidents and members of Congress believed that the Commander-in-Chief's authority to employ and govern the use of force derived from congressional action, and that Congress could regulate the use of force once initiated. Today, however, presidents argue that the Constitution itself grants them broad authority to determine whether military force is necessary, to give orders initiating the use of force, and to make decisions about how that force will be used. Presidents now argue that their authority to initiate hostilities comes from the Constitution, not the laws passed by Congress, and that Congress has no business interfering with it. Surprisingly, today, Congress mostly defers to these claims. If an essential constitutional power, initiating the use of military force, has shifted from one branch of government to another over time, it is important to study how that happened. In this book, I focus on just one clause of the Constitution, the Commander-in-Chief Clause. I trace how members of Congress talked about that clause, how they interpret it, and what discretionary authority they ascribed to it between the nation's founding and World War I. The congressional record illuminates how different members of Congress, in different partisan relations to the President, facing different governing challenges, answered the following questions. What independent authority does the Commander-in-Chief Clause bestow upon the person who is elected President? Where are the boundaries to that authority? What are the minimum Commander-in-Chief powers that Congress cannot take away from the President? What is the maximum the Commander-in-Chief can do in the face of congressional silence, or over Congress's objections? By examining every congressional reference to the clause from the founding to World War I describe with new specificity how members' interpretations of the Constitution evolved in the period predating the modern constitutional order. Analysis of congressional references to the Commander-in-Chief Clause contributes to the scholarly literature in several ways. First, it suggests a new way to divide the timeline of the modern presidency, especially as it relates to presidential war powers. My research shows that from the founding until 1898, members of Congress repeatedly articulated one dominant interpretation of the Commander-in-Chief Clause and the authority it conferred. This interpretation held that the clause granted the President only the type of authority held by any other military officer, which included some amount of discretion on the battlefield and no discretion in making policy about the initiation or scope of war and peace. But suddenly, around 1898 and continuing until World War I, a new and broader interpretation became dominant, which held that the President represented the nation and that, therefore, Congress owed him deference in policy-making decisions about the initiation and scope of war and peace. This finding informs scholarly debates about when war powers began to shift from Congress to the President, and suggests that the modern constitutional order for war powers has earlier roots than other scholars usually describe. Secondly, the analysis in this book adds rich detail to our understanding of what it looks like when Congress interprets the Constitution. In particular, it shows that when members of Congress defined the boundaries between their war powers and the President's, they referred frequently to a limited set of simple stories that prescribed a particular interpretation of the Commander-in-Chief Clause based on a select list of historical precedents tied together with a particular logic. Those stories, or constitutional scripts, seem to provide members of Congress with a shared, accessible language with which to understand novel dilemmas about interbranch relations. These scripts themselves are important because the language members used to describe the boundaries of each branch's war powers correlated with both the range of debates that took place in the legislature and the types of actions that Congress collectively took. While these stories feature prominently in congressional constitutional interpretations, it is important to be cautious about suggesting that the stories themselves affected the behavior of the individual members or the collective body at any given moment in time. If these constitutional stories shaped Congress's decision-making, they were certainly only one of many factors that did so. As described in the following chapters, prior to World War I, even when members' constitutional rhetoric relied heavily on stories, their interpretations and actions were also clearly shaped by other factors, like their own partisan relationship to the President, Congress's institutional resources, interpretations of other non-constitutional concepts like what constitutes offense, and existing racial and international orders. Timing the emergence of the modern constitutional order. Most people who study war powers in the U.S. constitutional system agree that today, presidents dominate foreign affairs and decisions about the use of military force. Presidents certainly claim a right to do so. Since the Truman administration, presidents have claimed broad authority to initiate hostilities and to ignore congressional attempts to limit that authority or ground it in law. These presidential claims have not generally brought presidents into sustained conflict with Congress, which has, in recent years, adopted a deferential posture toward the president's war powers authority. At the same time, Congress still involves itself in decisions about war policy. There have been moments when Congress asserted its legislative authority over the initiation of force, most famously when it passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973. Congressional politics still affects presidential choices, and congressional pressure can alter the trajectory of conflicts in the use of force. Congress and the President can each use their institutional strengths to reach constitutionally acceptable and authoritative decisions. But practitioners in our political system in the 21st century do not systematically question the President's authority to lead decision-making about or even initiate the use of force abroad in a broad range of circumstances. This institutional balance, sustained by bureaucratic capacity, law, treaties, and accepted rhetorical and political justifications, has been termed a modern constitutional order. Stephen Griffin defines a constitutional order as a relatively stable pattern of institutional actions, constructed by multiple institutions regarding constitutional powers. It is supported by widely held interpretations of the constitutional text, the structure and capacity of state institutions, and the political and policy objectives of officials. Griffin's definition is based on Orrin and Skowronek's ideas about political orders, defined by Rogers Smith as a constellation of rules, institutions, practices, and ideas that hang together over time as other things change. The modern constitutional order for war powers is supported by shared beliefs that the Constitution gives the President practical authority to conduct foreign and military affairs, including committing U.S. forces to at least limited engagements, and that it gives Congress at least some shared authority over spending and authorizing major wars. It is supported by the national security state and a large standing military, all reporting to the President. It is also supported by bipartisan foreign policy commitments to assertively promoting U.S. security, including the nation's economic interests and ideologic commitments abroad, as defined largely, though not exclusively, in the executive-led national security bureaucracy. The courts have helped to create and sustain this constitutional order by deferring to the political branches and by rejecting Congress's attempts to use the courts to restrain presidential actions. In Griffin's description, as in the work of Lewis Fisher and many others, this arrangement displaced an alternative, original constitutional order. Scholars show that in the original constitutional order for war powers, Congress asserted and defended its rights to declare wars and authorize undeclared wars. Courts largely ruled in favor of that dominance. Presidents did not claim the right to initiate hostilities on their own constitutional authority, and presidential unilateralism was the carefully defended exception and not the rule. U.S. security commitments focused on westward continental expansion rather than global leadership. The capacity of the national security bureaucracy and the military was far more limited than it is today, and as William Adler argues, the Secretary of War and field commanders had a great deal of independence from political control at the nation's periphery. Scholars make several different arguments about when this shift in constitutional orders took place. According to some, the shift to the modern constitutional order began in the late 1800s, with a gradual growth in authority as presidents began to unilaterally deploy force in order to protect Americans abroad. Another argument holds that the courts helped drive the shift in authority, because although 19th century court decisions largely affirmed the dominance of congressional authority over war powers, over time, outlying cases, especially United States versus Curtiss-Wright Export Corporation, 1936, helped to create a constitutional order that supported presidential unilateralism. Despite those earlier developments, most scholars date the beginning of the modern constitutional order for war powers as beginning in the mid-20th century. Many scholars point to a dramatic shift to the modern order when President Truman unilaterally initiated the Korean War, setting a precedent that potentially legitimated other actions. Others argue that what was most important to establishing the new constitutional order was its institutionalization of the executive branch, which also began with the Cold War. Still others argue that as the Cold War brought global superpower status to the United States, that status required a unitary foreign and military policy process led by the president. And so, the modern constitutional order followed from that security need. There are also explanations for this shift to the modern constitutional order for war powers that center Congress. Some scholars specifically attribute the growth of presidential war powers in the modern era to congressional deference to the president after World War II. Others attribute post-war changes to the internal structure of Congress during the Cold War, when defense-related committees began to be filled with hawks. John Hart Ely argues that Congress acquiesced to presidential leadership during the Vietnam War in part to avoid responsibility for what happened there. For her part, Mariah Zeisberg posits that Congress helped to construct the national security order that legitimized a broader definition of national defense. In addition, some scholars argue that the modern constitutional order for war powers was paradoxically further institutionalized with the passage of the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which unintentionally empowered the presidency by seeming to recognize a presidential right to deploy troops into hostile situations for up to 60 days. The legislative history of the War Powers Resolution shows that congressional collective action problems and party politics affected its passage and helped to create the contradictions in its text that led to that expansion of presidential power. Congress's posture of deference, emphasis on local domestic politics, and agreement with Cold War logic also helped to build and sustain this modern order. In general, though, most scholars agree that the president began to dominate war powers around the middle of the 20th century. On the other hand, some who study American political development caution against such clearly defined periodizations. They argue that what appear to be periods of stability are usually composed of multiple orders or patterned interactions of different origins, centered in institutions but also in constant political interaction. And indeed, within each of the periods roughly defined by the original and modern constitutional orders, there are actions that do not fit with the synthesis of the time period, such as when Polk unilaterally started the Mexican War, or when Eisenhower expressed deference to Congress about the possibilities of going to war over Taiwan. In both time periods, Congress was sometimes proactive about dictating policy to the president, and sometimes reacted, often deferentially, to presidential overreach. Closely examining congressional actions and deliberations about the use of force in the modern period shows that political considerations, leadership choices, and partisan politics all affect Congress's decision-making about whether to challenge the president's proposed policies. But conventional politics played a similar role in the early republic as well. So we should be cautious about characterizing entire time periods as fitting into an overarching synthesis. But at the same time, few question the fact that it is more common today than it was in the 19th century for presidents to take the initiative in using force, and that Congress's assertions of authority today are weaker than they once were. Institutions, political exigency, partisan politics, and technology have shaped contemporary ideas about the constitutional text and the authority it confers on presidents. In particular, staff in the executive branch and former executive staff in the legal academy have been critical actors in developing, articulating, and defending the logic and ideas that defend presidential unilateralism. In part as a consequence of their efforts, the ideas about authority articulated by political actors are different today than they were in the 19th century. The ways that modern actors construct authority today are shaped by ideas about security, interests, capitalism, race, threat, and American greatness that are embedded in multiple overlapping political orders. Earlier constructions of the constitutional text were similarly embedded in politics and ideas of the time. If today's executive-led constructions of war powers authority are rooted in particular ideas and logic, it makes sense to ask whether and how congressionally dominated constructions of war powers were similarly grounded. My research adds a new entry to these scholarly debates about when and how to define the emergence of the modern constitutional order for war powers. Focusing on the ideas and constitutional interpretations expressed in congressional debate, I argue that the groundwork for the modern constitutional order was laid after the Spanish-American War. The argument that emerged at that time was that the president represented the military, the flag, and the nation. This rhetoric displaced other congressional justifications for constrained presidential war power. The logic of congressional deference about a broad range of questions regarding war and peace that emerged around 1898 supplied reasoning and rhetoric to members of Congress who wished to support early acts of presidential unilateralism as the United States built its extracontinental empire in the early 20th century. While my research only shows a temporal association between the shift in available congressional logics and shifts in presidential governing behavior, other work suggests that such shifts in language may actually affect the distribution of constitutional and legal authority. John Dearborn shows that the argument that the president is the representative of the nation played an important role in congressional debates about domestic policy beginning around World War I. He shows that the argument that the president is national representative helped motivate Congress's construction of the president's domestic policy-making institutions, and that the weakening of that logic over time led Congress to assert more of its own authority over policy. My observations complement Dearborn's argument and suggest that what Jeremy Bailey describes as cyclical presidential claims to be the best representative of the nation became critically important to constitutional development around the turn of the 20th century. Congress's role in constitutional construction. Those who study American political development examine how institutions, politics, and policy interact to produce stability and change over time. Like institutions, however, ideas can also be important to political stability and change, because widely held ideas define repertoires of legitimate moves for political actors. Institutions and rules are embedded in ideas, and so changing patterns of thought and speech may be an important feature of institutional change. Vivian Schmidt argues that political discourse within and about institutions legitimizes ideas and debates about political action in a particular institution context, according to a logic of communication. The construction and evolution of war powers authority is unquestionably rooted in institutional capacity and shaped by ordinary politics. But the construction of constitutional meaning regarding war powers is also the creation and institutionalization of ideas. While civics textbooks often say that only courts can articulate authoritative ideas about constitutional meaning, scholars make both normative and empirical arguments about the ways that the other branches also participate in constitutional interpretation. Keith Whittington has defined constitutional construction as a type of deliberation that can be practiced by any of the branches of government. Constitutional construction sits at a midpoint between policy-making based on assumed consensus about textual meaning and revolution that abandons the constitutional text. He argues that any branch, in the moments of unsettled understanding, can consider fundamental political principles, examine textual meaning, and construct an interpretation of the Constitution's text that structures future political practice. Given that definition, actions alone do not construct a constitutional order. Ideas, language, and logical justifications are important as well. Indeed, scholars who have defined the modern constitutional order for war powers have looked to language and ideas expressed in presidential statements, legal memos, and Supreme Court decisions to explain how these institutions have constructed constitutional meaning and authority in the modern period. There is, furthermore, a growing interest in studying how Congress itself interprets and constructs constitutional meaning and authority. Some legal scholars argue that, normatively, Congress should have a significant role in construction of constitutional meaning. Deliberation, ideas, and reasoning are ideally among Congress's institutional strengths. Some argue that Congress is well equipped to participate in interpreting and constructing constitutional meaning, because as an institution, it has the capabilities to gather technical information and facts, to deliberate about them, and to include a wide range of voices and interests in that deliberation. And indeed, historically, both Congress and the President have interpreted, reinterpreted, and made fundamental changes to the meaning and operation of the constitutional text, even outside of the formal amendment process. In modern times, Bruce Ackerman argues that political pressure emerging from the context of the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement, expressed by Congress and the President, fundamentally reinterpreted and effectively changed the Constitution's meaning and values, which the court eventually ratified. Donald Morgan also chronicles various moments when Congress wrestled with and resolved constitutional dilemmas. And David...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?